This past year in American Studies, we have explored a wide range of American history topics. We started off this year by discussing The Color of Water, a book that took us through the themes of racism in the 1940s. From there, we explored declarations in history and Thoreau's idea of civil disobedience, which took us through the idea of changing an unjust government in the mid-1800s. We read The Way to Rainy Mountain, a book on the unjust treatment of Native Americans throughout American history. Right before winter break, we read Beloved, a book on racism in the 1860s, post-Civil War. We started our junior research paper second semester, where each of us explored different topics in American history. While we wrote our junior themes, we explored the Vietnam War. Our penultimate unit was reading The Great Gatsby, which explored organized crime in the 1920s. In this unit, we explored short stories and realized that the current American Studies curriculum severely lacks focus on systemic homophobia in the 1940s, as well as effects in the 1980s with the AIDS outbreak. The curriculum also lacks focus on the home front of the Vietnam War and suburbia during that time.
One of the stories that we feel should be added to the American Studies curriculum is White Angel. White Angel was published in 1988 and is a story about a family living in the suburbs of Cleveland during the 1960s to early 1970s. The two main characters, Bobby, who is 9 years old, and Carlton, who is 16 years old, are part of the youth counterculture movement at the time called hippies. Throughout the story, the two of them participate in activities that represent the hippie movement, such as doing drugs, drinking alcohol, and disrespecting their parents and participating in sexual activities. However, Carlton learns the dangers of this lifestyle when his life is ended prematurely while he is under the influence of drugs. His death tears up their white suburban family. This story is a reflection of both the time that the story took place and the time in which it was written. During both these times, overusage of drugs was a big problem. However, in the 1980s, the problem was a more addicting drug called crack cocaine instead of just weed and acid. Even though White Angel was set in the 1960s and 70s, and we did have a large unit for that time period about the Vietnam War, we never really went into much detail about what was happening on the home front. Yes, we did have a large unit about the people who were protesting the war, and some people who were for the war briefly, but we never really gave any attention to who these people were, or that time period in America, culturally. The people who were against the war were called hippies. This group of people were seen as uneducated because they were always looking for ways to get high, listen to music, and spread their belief of peace, not war. Hippies felt as though taking drugs was not bad because when they were learning about them in school, everything was exaggerated or not taken seriously. Then, after they tried these drugs, they realized that the things that the school was teaching them weren't necessarily true, so they weren't afraid to keep taking the drugs. Another big theme of hippies and the youth in general at that time period was breaking social norms. Families were no longer following the stereotypes of the nuclear family or the perfect family like they were in the 1950s. This led to families being closer and having more personal relationships, much like the ones we see today. However, this caused kids to also treat their parents with less respect than before. One more huge theme about that time period that basically shaped America sexually was a leisurely attitude that was starting to form about sex. Birth control was invented and kids felt as though they no longer had to worry about some of the repercussions of sex, such as unwanted children. If that wasn't enough, artists like Bob Dylan and the Beatles mentioned sex and drugs in their songs, furthering their influence of these things on the American youth.
White Angel has many important themes that all center around relationships. Kids in this story consistently are disobeying and disrespecting parents and participating in illegal activities that would have been seriously frowned upon before the counterculture movement. This resulted in many kids growing up much sooner than they should have. One more theme that was present in White Angel was a consistent battle between the new generation and the old generation. Readers can see the old family values reflected in the parents, and we can clearly see the suburban counterculture movement in the kids. All of the arguments that transpired between the parents and the kids were arguments about their opposing viewpoints on how their family and life in general should work. There were clear divides and beliefs between the new and the old. Between the two generations would change how we actually define ourselves as Americans. While we talked briefly in class about the 70s and the Vietnam War protesters, we could have gone into a lot more detail about what it meant to be a hippie or a member of counterculture, given that a lot of these themes came into life at the time and are still present in America today.
Another story that we feel should be added to the American Studies curriculum is Reprise. Reprise is a short story centering around the life of a gay man, Edmund White. The short story opens with a young 14-year-old Eddie and the tale of his sexual relationship with his mother's boyfriend's son, Jim, during 1954. The two are together until Eddie's parents find out about his sexuality and ship him off to boarding school and psychiatry. The story then peaks 40 years later, in 1994, when Eddie and Jim reunite and once again become lovers. It is revealed that Eddie became sick with HIV/AIDS by this point in 1994. Despite this, Eddie and Jim have sex, meaning that either Jim was willing to risk contraction to this dangerous disease, or he himself was already infected. Here's a little information about Edmund White, the author. He is a gay writer who grew up in the suburbs on the outskirts of Chicago during the 1940s and 1950s. He lived in France from 1983 to 1990, and when he came home, he was met with an AIDS-ridden country. He lost many friends to the disease. White was a central author for upper-class, privileged gay men in the later half of the 20th century.
A huge part of American history is the oppression of gay people. To have a well-rounded understanding of what it means to be an American, students should have a basic understanding of systemic homophobia in America. There is an underlying theme, or reprise as one might say, of oppression of gay people showcased in Reprise. For example, Eddie must stay in the closet, and when he is outed, his parents sent him to boarding school and a psychiatrist. Reprise opens up the conversation of gay rights, allowing teachers to discuss aversion therapy, how homosexuality was officially considered a mental illness prior to 1973, and systemic homophobia. Some examples of the way our country is and has been systemically homophobic is how legally unequal and unprotected gay people have been on the accounts of marriage, adoption, employment, hate crime laws, service discrimination, and much more. Reprise also includes the topic of HIV/AIDS, an epidemic in the 1980s and 1990s that changed the dynamic between homosexual and heterosexual Americans. The public had a very hard time understanding AIDS due to misinformation. HIV/AIDS and those who suffered with the disease were brushed off by many government and medical groups because they didn't think it was important or relevant as it was happening to the gay community. However, the public perception of HIV/AIDS in conjunction with gay rights slowly changed from one of fear and hatred to one of acceptance and support. Gay rights are a current pressing matter, and by including Reprise into the curriculum, American Studies teachers would have the ability to look at this present concern through a historic lens.
Clearly, both Reprise and White Angel are short stories with extremely relevant topics to American studies and would open up conversations that are currently absent from our curriculum.